Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second of our webinars, which we're putting on. So my name is Professor Michael Gasiorek, and I'm the co-director of the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy, together with Professor Alan Winters. We're running this series of occasional webinars on topics that we think are interesting and topical, designed for the general public, the general practitioners, for anybody who's interested in trade policy issues. I'm really delighted today to welcome Professor Simon Evenett, who's going to talk to us about his work on monitoring the extent to which countries have introduced policies with regard to the Sustainable Development Goals. As I said, I'm really delighted to welcome Simon. Simon is currently Professor of International Trade and Economic Development at the University of St. Gallen, and was, I think, the founding member, the founding person, the guy who had the brainchild of creating the Global Trade Alert. And indeed, I remember going for the launch, which I think was in 2009. So the Global Trade Alert was launched immediately after the financial crisis because there was a fear that countries would resort to increasingly protectionist policies. So the idea, I'm sure Simon can talk about this much more lyrically than I can, but the idea behind the Global Trade Alerts was essentially to track and monitor all the policies that governments were introducing around the world, which may be impacting on trade and investment flows. And that project has been a fantastic project, which has continued ever since. And actually, with the rise in, I guess, protectionism or interventionism that we're seeing over the last 2-3 years, and increasing growth in that, I think the work of the GTA is probably going to become increasingly important and relevant. More specifically today, and Simon will talk about this in more detail, obviously himself, he's going to talk to us about trade and industrial policy and the Sustainable Development Goals and the work they've done on tracking the policies that governments have introduced with regard to the Sustainable Development Goals. A tiny little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Simon. So the chat function is not enabled for the participants, all the participants. So if you have any questions for Simon, then please post them in the Q&A box. We will be monitoring that. Feel free to ask a question as Simon is speaking, but keep those questions while he's speaking. Really, if there's anything that you require some clarification on, Simon will talk for approximately half an hour, and then we'll open up to a general Q&A. So Simon, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Michael, for that kind introduction. And you're quite right. We kicked off the Global Trade Alert in June of 2009. I think the great Peter Mandelson launched us, if I remember rightly, with his speech during what was then called World Trade Week in the UK. Well, it's true that since then we have managed to document over 50,000 commercial policy interventions worldwide. And originally, as you highlighted, Michael, the intention was to see if governments were resorting to discrimination in their response to the global financial crisis. And of course, that crisis passed. We carried on. And over time, there has, of course, been interest in the other trade consequences of commercial policy. And one area which receives a lot of attention is, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals amongst the development community. And what we wanted to do was to speak to how the extent to which commercial policy changes may have contributed or not to attaining the SDGs. So I will now raise my slides and try and take you through the material we have. I am going to describe, or rather summarize, the findings of the 30th Global Trade Alert Report, which is called Must Do Better. This is co-authored with Johannes Fritz, my colleague at the St. Gallen Endowment, and the two of us have prepared this report, and I will also explain to you later how we want to take this work forward, and I would be really very open to suggestions from yourselves for how we could make more use of this information. So let me start off with some motivation for this. And doing the research for this report was, at some points, a little bit depressing, because amongst quite a number of the trade policy community, lip service is paid to the contribution of trade policy to the SDGs. And we have a strange situation where everyone acknowledges the SDGs are a accepted global goal, or at least they're a global goal, let's put it that way. And many in the trade policy community are a little bit skeptical about the relationship between the two. I'll unpack that in more detail on the fourth slide. But to motivate this, let's go back to the beginning. The Agenda 2030 was adopted by the United Nations in 2015 and came into force on the 1st of January 2016. It is one of the few global initiatives adopted by governments this century. And if we were to fail to deliver on this, I think this would be counted as another black mark against global governance in what has been, unfortunately, a long list of unsuccessful attempts to get countries to work together. So there's a lot at stake here, I think, in terms of the credibility of the UN and of the development community. Unfortunately, by most accounts, we are behind schedule in attaining these goals. And I have here a quote from the UN Secretary General from July of last year. Our world is in deep trouble, so too are the Sustainable Development Goals. I think he's summarizing one of the reports that the UN puts out from time to time, showing we are not making as much progress as we could be. Now, most of those reports focus naturally on the outcomes, the SDG indicators and targets, and how well countries are doing getting close to them or closer to them. We have much less attention on policy choices and on the links between policy choices and those potential outcomes. And this is an area where we hope to make a contribution. I think this is of practical importance too. It's certainly not meant to be just an academic exercise, because there is the old dictum from Peter Drucker that what gets measured gets managed. And governments and international organizations need ways to track the likely SDG impact of different policy choices. They need ways to track the overall policy stance towards a particular SDG indicator. And you can break it down by SDG indicator or by nation and government. We need also, looking across countries, we might find there are different ways to attain an SDG target that countries have chosen, and that may inform public policy choice as well. And of course, the holy grail is to try and devise some type of coherent policy that taps the benefits of openness and globalization, and yet advances economic development, economic and social development as well. So I think for the very practical business of tracking what governments are doing, seeing if they're on track, whether they can improve their policy mixes, we need some way essentially to tag trade policy interventions and see which SDG indicators are potentially affected by them. And the other important reason we need to do this, and we do have colleagues from the research community on the webinar, is that if we're going to get serious about studying the impact of trade policy interventions on SDGs, then we, of course, need to take a stand on which policy interventions affect which SDGs. And so those types of linkages need to be established. I should add that there are, and we discussed this in the report, a small number of case studies which try and do that, and that they are few and far between. I wish there were many more of them, and maybe the type of tagging that we are going to do might accelerate that process. So this is the motivation as to why I think public policy officials, researchers, people in think tanks, people who care about development policy should be interested in the links between commercial policy and the SDGs. The contents of this presentation are as follows. I'm going to organize the presentation around a number of questions to try and show you how the work we've done in this report fills some key knowledge gaps. We're going to start by asking how often has commercial policy contributed towards attaining certain SDG targets, and do we see differences across the SDGs? The second question we'll look at is, did the contribution of commercial policy to attaining the SDGs change once Agenda 2030 was implemented, or did we just carry on as we were before? So what do aggregate measures of policy stance say about the before and after the adoption of Agenda 2030? Then the third question is, given the way the SDGs are stated, are there any tensions between liberalizing commercial policy and attaining an SDG target? And is this a problem for certain SDGs? The fourth question will ask whether or not the COVID-19 pandemic blew us off track and we ended up with more SDG impairing policies or policies which take us back away from the SDG targets. And the fifth question is to ask, well, where could more openness contribute towards improving SDG performance? So these are the questions that I would like to address after I have discussed the standing of the SDGs in the trade policy community, which is my next slide. Now, one of the interesting things doing the research for this report, and I canvassed a number of views, including a few people on this particular call, I also asked people, well, how do you assess the SDGs from a trade policy point of view? And I found four sets of answers when talking to colleagues and reading. The first point is, of course, there are some people who just think, who are opposed to what they see as neoliberal commercial policy, and some people who are proposing deglobalization, or at least jollying it along. And they are, of course, ones who do not see any role for trade policy of the SDGs. If anything, for these people, the less that trade policy had to do with it, the better. So that's one group of opponents, not, I would say, mainstream academic economic opinion, but still they are there. A second group, second opinion you'll run into, especially if you talk to some of the American-based analysts and officials, is they equate trade policy in the SDGs with the WTO, and they say, look, the WTO is not a development organization. That's not the problems we solve there. And so bringing the SDGs into this discussion, at least in Geneva, is not very welcome. And so for them, I don't think they're particularly interested in this. And so that's one group who are particularly indifferent to the trade and SDG discussion. Then there's a third group of people, a dwindling number, for whom globalization has to be a silver bullet, or they're not interested. That is, commercial policy has to fix all problems. Otherwise, please don't bother me with this. So for them, it's almost as if they want to see globalization. If people are going to claim globalization or trade policy is the way to help attain the SDGs, they want to see complete success across the board. And I think most of us would accept that the idea that commercial policy is a silver bullet is, given the wide variety of the SDGs which are around, is probably not where we're at. The last group, this is, I think, the most substantively interesting group, is a group of perhaps trade policy analysts who will the ends of the SDGs largely. By and large, they can see why development is a multifaceted process, why there are a number of different facets to development, but they're not very sure about how the SDGs have either been formulated or the role of commercial policy. And here, this breaks down into four parts. There are some who would challenge the formulation and the identification of these SDG targets. There are things which have been left out and some things which have been put in, which they may or may not approve of. And so you do get some people who take issue with how the SDGs are drafted. The second group would question whether commercial policy is the right instrument to use, based often on first, second, or third best grounds, and also where they would note the redistributive nature of trade policy, meaning that you're likely to shift income between groups, and that may help on some SDGs and not on others. And so that picking up the redistributive nature of trade policy and claiming that's a success is something some people find unappealing. The third critique would be to say, well, SDGs focus on national outcomes, but often trade policy has cross-border outcomes. And so if a country bans the exportation of vaccines, this has knock-on effects in other countries. And so trying to take account of that in a SDG type initiative is something which doesn't seem to have been given much attention. And so that the inherently cross-border nature of commercial policy doesn't seem to come out very well in the SDGs, the way it's formulated and articulated. And the last problem, of course, is that some commercial policies affect multiple SDGs. And suppose you have a commercial policy intervention that improves some SDGs and worsens others. What are we to make of that? So I find these last sets of concerns which have been raised much more, this is a much more fruitful place to have a discussion. I think my overall view is I actually buy a lot of the critiques, and we pretty much say as much in the report. We should not be praising trade policy, the choice of the second or third best trade policy as helping with some SDG if there's some better first best policy which could be used instead. And that's a theme I'll come back to later. So there's a lot in this fourth critique that I actually agree with. But nevertheless, we took the view that we wanted to see from the data that we had collected on policy intervention, what had governments done and to what extent it could be connected to any of the SDG targets. Now, we have, I was just checking the questions there to make sure there was any directed towards me, and there are not so far. Good. Let's proceed then to tell you what we did. So our view was to say, given that we have this rather large global database on commercial policy intervention, principally trade and investment policy tools, or trade policy tools as you would normally understand them, except TBT and SPS, which we let the WTO cover in their EPING database. Industrial policy here is principally selective trade policy, selective policy intervention, so not across the board horizontal measures. We're talking much more targeted measures, so things like subsidy interventions, local content requirements, things like this. So given that universe of policy intervention, what have we seen over time in the potential impacts on the SDGs? And so what we did was to look into our database. We have 62 different types of policy intervention, and many of them have broadly similar effects. So we grouped them into 12 groups. We also looked at the SDG indicators. We focused on 7 of the SDGs, and we found 61 SDG indicators where we thought there was market processes at work, and therefore a potential role for trade policy. Notice I say the word potential, or for FDI policy. And there are clearly some SDG indicators which have nothing to do with market processes, which are important from a development point of view, but which we do not say anything about. So I don't want you to think that the 61 SDG indicators is the universe. It certainly isn't, but it's a large enough number of them. What we did was to take each one of those indicators and to do a literal reading of them. And so I give an example here of SDG target 2.1, which refers to ending hunger. And this in particular refers in particular to the availability of food. And so where we saw a target or an indicator where it was about the availability of an item, then we asked ourselves to what extent could trade policy make a good more or less available. You can view that perhaps in terms of the price of the good. And so any trade policy intervention which lowered the domestic price of the good would count towards this particular SDG target. So lowering import tariffs, expanding import quotas, even putting in place an export ban from the country of a particular good, food here, would contribute positively. But what we would not do in the case where the metric was defined in terms of availability of an item for consumers is to say the measure that increased production counted positively towards this SDGs, because any measure that increases production that production could be exported. And so the argument we used was that for metrics, SDG metrics, which were about availability of goods or medicines and things like this, we looked at the impact on the domestic price and to see what the trade or industrial policy or FDI policy intervention was likely to have there. Then there are some other SDG targets which are very much producer-based, where either is reference to the levels of employment or to the value added, value created, and there we looked at what would be the likely impact on the producer surplus of firms in a particular sector. So in this way, the SDG indicators were sorted into different groups. The two biggest groups are the availability group and the production group. And what we did was we took the classic textbook model of international trade that we all learn, the starting point for a short run, single market, partial equilibrium, perfectly competitive, small open economy model. And basically, for every one of our 12 types of policy interventions, classified whether or not raising that policy, that is like raising a tariff or increasing a subsidy, whether that would hurt or harm any one SDG indicator which we could identify. And so we use this simplest possible model to come up with a prediction about whether or not an increase in a barrier would harm or benefit the attainment of an SDG. And so this is a key step. Now, of course, we don't claim this is the last word on this, but we are clear about one thing. Anyone who wants to work in this business tying policy intervention to SDGs has to have a causal story. They have to have a story about how market outcomes are influenced by policy intervention. And we took the simplest model that everyone was trained as an undergraduate, and then or even at high school, and use that one. That's very much the starting point. And we recognize that there are many, many other economic models, and some people may have a preferred one. And all we would say is that they should then rip out from our approach, our particular the theoretical model, and insert their one in, and then redo the analysis. But at least we're clear about what our starting point is. Now, I do see a question, so let's see in this. Okay, so I'll come to SDG 8 in a minute. We can talk a bit about this. There's the SDGs targets that we chose were ones we thought we could say something about, and often not ones where we're selective. And remember, our database is about selective interventions, like putting up the tariffs on wheat or something like this, or subsidies in agriculture. Some of the SDGs refer to macro economy-wide metrics, and I believe that's the case in some of SDG 8. But as I'll argue later in further work, we want to go through all the other SDGs and see whether or not we can say something about them. So it's more a matter of whether we think we can say to credibly link selective trade policy intervention to market outcomes. So scope, yes, we can expand the scope on SDGs, but we had to start somewhere, and this is where we did start. So ultimately, what we want to be able to do is to take the 50,000 plus policy interventions in the Global Trade Alert database and find which ones could plausibly be connected to an SDG, and then develop a mapping which links the policy intervention to the SDG, and then use that to help count the number of policy changes which are benefiting or improving or worsening some SDG indicator metric. So the mapping that we need a mapping that maps commercial policy choice to SDG indicators. And since those SDG indicators are often linked to certain sectors or products or themes, then of course that's an important filter as well. We list here a whole series of features of the mapping. We should have a mapping which is based in economic logic. It should be easily communicated and intelligible. We chose the one which everyone has heard of. And we must apply the mapping consistently across indicators of a similar type. And of course, with coding these days, that is absolutely possible. And of course, the mapping has to be one which is replicable by others. So we put together essentially a mapping that links SDG indicators to commercial policy interventions. And we then took our global database and looked at as much data as we could from all countries in the world to see how much information we had on SDG attainment. Now, as I said, we have 7 SDGs that we are tracking here, or at least looking at potential links between policy intervention and SDG outcomes. We have countries from all levels of income and per capita income levels. This chart shows you for the seven SDGs, maybe for SDGs 1, 2, and 9, we have information on policy interventions by well over 150 jurisdictions, nearly 200. And there are some SDGs like 3 and 6, where we have fewer information on fewer jurisdictions. And you can see that all income levels are represented, although in SDG 3 and 6, low income nations perhaps less. So we drew from policy intervention across the world in producing the statistics which I'm about to show you. So we were able to take our 50,000 unilateral policy interventions, and in 13,000 or so of them, we could find no credible link to the 61 SDG indicators that we talked about. And so we excluded those 13,000 from the analysis. For the other 37,000 policy interventions which have been undertaken since November 2008, we could credibly link them to some SDG indicator. And interestingly, if you take the period since November 2008 on, about 19,000 of those interventions have taken place since Agenda 2030 came into force. Now, when you look across our 7 SDGs, and bearing in mind that a policy intervention could affect more than one SDG indicator or more than one SDG, we see quite a lot of variation in the number of policy interventions that affect different SDGs, with SDG 3 seeing the least number of interventions, followed by SDG 14, which is life underwater, but through to SDGs 1, poverty, and SDG 9, private sector development, which have very high, lots of policy interventions that plausibly affect the SDG indicators in there. Now, the third substantive column here shows you what's the share of policy interventions which are contributing positively towards this indicator since Agenda 2030 came into force. This varies a lot. So when you're talking about SDG 6, which is about clean water, about 20% of the interventions that affect that sector contributed positively, which suggests that 80% did not. So here, you have if you were to make the case that trade and commercial policy is actually setting things backwards, one would point to SDG 6. Now, when you look at the other end of the spectrum, SDG 2 and SDG 9, you can see that over 70% of policy interventions, commercial policy interventions in those cases, have contributed positively towards these SDG indicators. So there's quite a significant difference across SDG indicators or SDGs in how often commercial policy is contributing positively. Then if you go to the next column, you'll see how often in each of these SDGs, trade policy or commercial policy has been liberalized. And here you get very different percentages or shares than the ones you have in the share of commercial policy interventions which are positively contributing towards an indicator. So if you compare the 4th and the 5th columns here, you get some very interesting results. So if you take SDG 9, 76% of the policy interventions affecting SDG 9 contribute towards attaining those goals. Actually, these are mainly policy interventions that increase production, value-added employment. But only 19% of those policy interventions are liberalizing. And so I'll come back to this point later, because this is probably the SDG where there's perhaps the biggest tension. More generally, when you look across the policy interventions that affect the SDGs, the commercial policy interventions, only a quarter of them, 24%, involve liberalization. 76% involve some type of trade distortion or trade restriction. And so we have, the balance of the interventions are on the restrictive and distortive side. And given the way the SDGs are constructed, in some SDGs that actually records very positively towards attaining those goals. And this, of course, highlights where potential tensions are. I return to that point. But the first point to make is we can map between these policy interventions and the SDG targets and indicators. And you can see here there's quite a significant amount of variation which analysts and policymakers may want to explore further. Now turning to the questions that we posed with this database. So think of this huge database then now being used to come up with assessments of how global commercial policy stances change. So we could have prepared these charts for each SDG. We could have prepared them for each nation, perhaps. But let's suppose we are interested in the global totals. How have they changed over time? And did they change before and after the implementation of Agenda 2030? The short answer is no. What we do in this chart here is, before Agenda 2030 is put in place, we plotted the share of commercial policy interventions that have a positive effect on an SDG. And then we plotted the same share since Agenda 2030 came into effect on the vertical axis. And what we can see is that for all of the SDGs that we track here, all 7 of them, the share that we saw before 2016 is very similar to the share after 2016, which suggests that Agenda 2030 was implemented and we did not see a big shift in commercial policy intervention, either in favor or against SDG attainment. It's almost as if trade policy just carried on regardless of Agenda 2030. So that's the first and perhaps a little bit depressing finding. The second is, did we see a tension between attaining SDGs and liberal commercial policy? And here the SDGs break up into 3 groups. I've already talked about SDG 9. SDG 9 is full of indicators which increase literally when the short-run profitability of a sector increases or when employment increases. And these are all things which would plausibly be improved if governments were to start raising trade barriers or offering subsidies. So in that particular case, SDG 9, with the short, small open economy model that we have, the textbook model that we chose, I'm afraid to say there it appears to be quite a serious tension between openness and SDG attainment. Now, of course, you can come back and say, well, look, if we look into medium-term and longer-term effects, if we take that perspective, then the types of trade distortions and subsidies I've mentioned may be very harmful to production and employment levels, in which case a different economic framework might eliminate this tension. But at least in terms of the textbook case we have, this is what we found. Now, fortunately, that tension is not there in every SDG. And indeed, if you go to SDGs 1 and 6, there's very little tension at all. So it's not obvious that the SDGs and openness are at war with one another. It just turns out that I think in one of the SDGs, the way they are framed is one has to acknowledge that at least the textbook approach that we would consider, we'll put it there. We have intermediate cases for 4 of the other SDGs. And so you can see that in this chart as well. So we have a question which, all right, we have a question asking about potential impacts on populations. We haven't done that, but we could in principle do that, I suppose, for SDG interventions where that makes sense. Yeah. No, we haven't done this. You can see that this is what we're doing here is summarizing policy stance. And of course, this of course means that policy intervention by, I guess, a small country like Liechtenstein counts as much as a policy intervention by France. And that may not be the most intuitive way of thinking about this. But still, as I said, we have to start somewhere, and that's exactly what we're doing here. The second question that we have is, did the pandemic blow us off course? And so in this plot here, what we did was to ask, do we see more positive impacts on SDGs in the pandemic era than before? And did we see resort to more liberalization than we did before? And so our 7 SDGs fall into 4 groups. SDGs 1, 6, and 7 are ones where we saw more progress towards the SDG and more liberalization in the pandemic era compared to the years before the pandemic. So there would seem to be an alignment there. On SDGs 14 and 3, we see the opposite. We see less attainment of SDGs or policy which is less likely to improve an SDG, and we see more restrictions. And then for SDGs 9 and 2, we get intermediate results. But in the case of 4 of the SDGs, we see that the pandemic era saw more commercial policy interventions which are likely to have a positive effect. And so the idea that the pandemic necessarily blew us off course with the SDGs, attaining the SDGs, I think we can be skeptical of, at least as far as commercial policy is concerned. So there may well be other very important reasons why SDG attainment has been affected by the pandemic, but it would be hard to say that commercial policy was across the board a factor which took us back in this respect. And this, of course, the variation across the SDGs that we have here suggests that governments may well have made very different choices with respect to different types of or different sectors of the economy. So the results vary across the SDGs as to whether the pandemic made a difference. Could more liberal trade policy contribute towards SDG attainment? What we did in the report here, and I will not go too much into the details, was to create 4 reform scenarios where you progressively replaced more and more of the trade distortions that were put in place either temporarily or for a finite period of time or permanently with reforms. So you either phase out the trade restrictions, or you make permanent time-limited commercial policy reforms that governments have already taken. And what you can show is the share of SDG share of measures, the commercial policy measures that would help with SDG attainment will rise in 6 out of 7 of these SDGs, with perhaps the biggest impacts being in SDGs 1, 2, 3, 6, and 7. When it comes to SDG 14, none of the reform scenarios we really worked with really moved the needle compared to the share of measures which were benefiting in SDG that were in force at the end of November of last year. So that's the benchmark, and against that, you can see that the 4 dots for SDG 14 are very similar. So very little juice there. And of course, for SDG 9, if you start ripping up trade barriers or rather tearing down trade barriers, eliminating production subsidies, then in the short-term textbook model we have, that is going to reduce value added, reduce profitability, reduce employment, and this is going to knock SDG attainment for 6 on that one. So you can see here that at least as far as 5 of the 7 SDGs that we talked about, there is room for liberalization to have contributed more towards SDG attainments, which is, I think, a positive message. Now, having laid out the results for you, I'd like to talk a little bit about the next steps that we want to take. We have, of course, tagged these interventions in our GTA database, linking a policy intervention to an SDG target and to whether or not they're likely to have positive or negative impacts. We're in the process of upgrading the Global Trade Alert website so that users can go in and search that website for all the policy interventions that affect perhaps one type of SDG target, or for all the policy interventions which are implemented by a country that affect its own home development outcomes. And let me say, I should have said this at the beginning, our analysis looks at the impact of a country's commercial policies on its own SDGs. That is what we did in this study. I'll come back to alternatives in a second or two. We are going to also make the database that you can download from the Global Trade Alert website. We will update that file so as to be able to include all of these tags. So for people who want to, who are used to using very large data sets, they can go through and then sort out which countries have been doing what with respect to which SDGs. And this will help with the type of empirical work which I think is desperately needed. We will certainly consider tagging more SDG targets and SDGs, and Ingo's question spoke exactly to that. And we are also going to explore whether there is a credible way to tag the impact of a nation's commercial policy choices on the ability of their trading partners, or the likelihood of their trading partners meeting an SDG. So this, of course, will then bring in the cross-border dimension, which of course is central to so many discussions in trade and development policy. Okay, I will then conclude with the following remarks here. So in terms of what we have done, and we see this as an ongoing project. I've already just told you where I think we're going to go with this next. We're not done here. Our approach is best thought of seen as characterizing trade and investment policy stance and changes over time. There are obviously lots of different ways in which you can construct indicators of policy stance. And there's already been the suggestion from one of the questions that one could weight measures by population size and alike, or other metrics. So again, plenty of work to be done there. We want to be very clear that in characterizing policy stance, we are not estimating effects of SDG indicators. Our frame, the approach we took, we hope is clear. We really wanted to lay out in the report what this mapping was, precisely because I'm quite sure that there are a lot of people who would disagree either with the choice of economic model or maybe how an SDG indicator has been read. I mean, we have a literal reading. Other people may read them differently. But either way, one needs a mapping, whatever, if you're going to do this in a consistent and coherent way. We found that not every commercial policy indicator can affect an SDG, and not every SDG indicator is necessarily going to be affected by a commercial policy intervention. There are plenty of SDG indicators which do not relate to market outcomes. They may relate to things like very important things like rights, which are arguably unrelated, at least not directly related to trade policy. We saw when we looked across the 7 SDGs here, the generalization in terms of how trade friendly, or at least how much trade policy has contributed towards SDGs. Generalizations of like that, generalizations about chain across the SDGs are probably unwise. There's quite a lot of variation, which we can get our teeth into and further work. Generalizations over time, on the other hand, I think are very, here you're on much stronger ground. We saw very little impact of the implementation of Agenda 2030 on trade policy choice, at least as it manifests itself in terms of SDG impact. But we did see interesting results of the pandemic as well, which I already articulated. Nevertheless, our bottom line in terms of what trade policy and openness can contribute is that even if you have some concerns about how the SDGs were formulated, there is still room for more global engagement in terms of trade and investment policy in contributing to at least 5 of the 7 SDGs that we saw here. And so the idea that trade policy and commercial policy is a tension with the SDGs is not true in all cases. In fact, in many cases, quite the opposite. Trade policy and commercial policy could improve the availability of food, medicines, technologies, and the like. And these are very good reasons for thinking that trade policy and openness can make a positive contribution towards the SDGs, although one should not think that every SDG indicator will improve as countries liberalize. I have a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe I'll stop here and we can take them up in Q&A, or we can bridge to that at this point. So let me thank you, turn off the slides, and hand it back to Michael.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Simon. That was really, really interesting. And I have to say, I think doing this sort of mapping is incredibly important and very, very worthwhile, and is very much a public good, as has been the GTA database. You have got a couple of questions from Andy McKay. Before we switch to those questions, I have a related question, so I'm going to kind of segue into that as well. At the very beginning, you talked about lip service being paid to the SDGs and so on. And I guess my question is, and then you had one of your graphs which showed that other than for SDG 9, actually a more liberal commercial policy isn't necessarily in conflict with the SDGs, and that's then related to Andy McKay's question. My specific question is it not the case that the primary purpose, if you like, primary focus of much commercial policy is more concerned with issues around SDG 9 and possibly SDG 8, but you're not dealing with SDG 8. So let's focus on SDG 9. And that is where you do see a conflict or a potential conflict. So to what extent is it that it's lip service that's being paid, or that actually there is a tension between the SDGs and a liberalizing commercial policy? And then Andy's question which I'll read out, so I'm not sure if everybody can see it, is you seem to be very positive about the impact of openness on SDGs 1 and 2, but is there not an ambiguity here? For example, how might import liberalisation affecting food products affect local agricultural production? So Andy's also suggesting actually there's perhaps more tensions than some of the other SDGs.
All right, let me start by saying two things. So first, with respect to the lip service, where by lip service I meant that you could talk to people about, many people in the trade policy community, about trade policy and the SDGs. They will engage in a conversation for this for about 30 seconds and then it just stops. It's just, no one is going to go out there on record saying the SDGs are irrelevant, but this is not central to how they think about how trade policy should be formulated. And so that's the sense in which I meant it. Okay, not you. I think you've developed a much more sort of thoughtful reason for maybe why lip service happens. I don't think that's the case. I think for a lot of people in the trade policy community, they see the SDGs, but they were not created by them. They were not involved in them, and they don't see how it fits naturally with their worldview. Okay, so I think that's it. Now, let's come to the important point you just raised and Andy's raised as well. And this is why I was clear about saying this. When we read the SDG indicators, those SDG indicators, when read literally, which are production-based, are ones where you will get the tension, right? And if the SDG has a lot of production-based SDG indicators in it, the tension shows up as it does in number 9. In SDGs 1 and 2, there are also a lot of what we call consumption or availability-based SDG indicators, where reforming trade policy, lowering trade barriers, actually improves access to food and things like this. So a lot has to do with the way in which the SDG indicators are drafted, and what's the mix or the balance in an SDG between production-related SDG indicators and availability or consumption-based ones. And in 9, it's almost entirely on one-sided. On 1 and 2, it's much more mixed. In fact, there's quite a lot of availability-based indicators, and that's why I think you get the results which are what they are.
But I guess, as Andy points out, even for one, to do with no poverty, if you liberalise trade, that may impact negatively on domestic agricultural producers. So that's what you're saying about this trade-off between production and consumption-based outcomes. But you seem to be focusing quite a lot more on the consumption-based outcomes in the other indicators. Is that fair or is that not fair?
I think when we looked at let's take the poverty ones, we asked we were very clear about seeing a link then between trade barrier changes and the cost of living, right? So you go through that mechanism, you're going to get a more consumption-based story. If you're going to tell a story about how reshuffling of workers between industries and the like, you could probably come up with a more negative story. But I think what you've got to do is you have to take a stand on this, and we have. And as Andy's question shows, maybe if you look at what drives poverty differently, so if you had a different view about what drove poverty, then for SDG 1, one could build a different mapping. But at least we'd have a mapping, and that's what we need.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, next question from Ingo Borkert. You explained that you link commercial policy to outcomes in the same country. This is a sensible starting point, but the crux is, of course, that impacts manifest elsewhere. If the US subsidized cotton, it will benefit SDG attainment in the US, but deteriorate it in a range of African economies where we'd be much more concerned about SDG attainment.
I couldn't agree more. And so that, again, it's thinking about how to build a coherent mapping there. So the example which Ingo's given is a great one with respect to subsidies of, in particular, export subsidies, say, of cotton. You could quite easily trace out what the adverse impacts could be. But let's take a case like one I was discussing over lunch with a Brazilian colleague, which is, suppose Brazil puts up import barriers on Uruguayan beef. If Uruguay can just ship that beef and sell that almost commodity somewhere else, in principle, there's not much of a harm done, right? So there are, one has to go through this quite carefully for different types of products But it could be done. It'll be more messy than where we started out, but yes, it could be done, and one could develop a mapping like this, and I think this would then enrich the discussion even more.
And I guess the obvious question then, as you say, it could be done. Are you considering doing it?
Yeah, we are. And that's exactly why I was discussing this with a colleague at lunch, precisely because we recognise that this could be a way in which this could go forward.
Okay, great. Moving on to a question from Alan Winters. SDGs are implicitly averages. Trade policy typically has heterogeneous effects. So I guess the implicitly is, how does one use this sort of mapping to try and unpick and understand those heterogeneous effects?
If by heterogeneity, Alan means different heterogeneity across different groups in society, then that does come out in the way that the SDGs are constructed often, because some SDGs refer to income, some refer to cost of living and availability. So that would be already in there. If he's talking about heterogeneity, say within an employer, a sector across different types of workers. So maybe you're interested in gender splits, which is a great question. Then that would require, I think, a bit more work. So I think it much depends on which heterogeneity Alan has in mind, but I can think of some where he may have.
Great. Let me ask another question, something that I think you and I have talked a little about before, but I'm going to press you on it again, which is, if I understand correctly, what you're doing in the database, and also in regard to this work, is very much focusing on the unilateral policies pursued by countries. You're not taking into account you're certainly not taking into account policies that are part of, for example, free trade agreements. And increasingly, we see chapters in free trade agreements that are concerned with various aspects of the SDGs. So there's, if you like, there's an important side of commercial policy here, which we're not taking into account of in this map exercise. But then there's also which are also unilateral policies, countries' GSP style policies, generalized system of preferences policies, which are of course unilateral, but which also can have a sort of SDG component. And interestingly, in the UK's recent revision of its GSP program, the DCTS, it's actually taken out some of those requirements, such as the need to sign up to ILO conventions on human rights and worker rights. And that then relates back to Ingo's very first question about the fact that you're not including that SDG. So I'm just wondering whether you have any plans for trying to incorporate any of those other elements, or differently, how important you think those initiatives are. Let me then finally rephrase that question very slightly differently. It might be that with regard to unilateral trade policy, governments are not managing to take much note of many of the SDGs. The answer is, yeah, but we're doing that through FTAs. Right,
so you've said two things. So I can clear up one of them straight away. GSP policies are unilateral policies. They're in our database, and we try and track them closely.
Okay.
So that bit is in. You're right that we do not cover RTAs, and that was for the simple reason that when we started off the Global Trade Alert work, the RTAs were being texts were being collected by the WTO and still are to this day. So there was a repository of those, which is there. So if one wants to explore what governments are doing in RTAs, there is already that data which has been collected there. What no one has done, I think, is perhaps coded it in a systematic way, preparing a mapping in the way that we have. I take that point. I'm not sure I've seen anyone do that, but it's not, the data gap we had back in 2009 was on unilateral policies beyond tariffs and agricultural subsidies and trade defense. And that's what the Global Trade Alert was built to try and remedy that deficiency. In part, I imagine, not wholly, but still, that's what we were building. And we always knew that the RTA database that the WTO maintained was always there. But it's true that a government could come back to us and say, well, we do all that in RTAs, in which case I'd like to see the evidence. I mean, and it may be true.
And then I also had another question I was thinking as you were talking. As a result of the work that you've done on this and the clearly deep thinking that you've done about this, are there any particular policies that you think governments could and should be doing more of in order to pay less lip service? What would your advice be?
I think
if Kenny Badenoch called you into the office and said, how could we use our trade policy to help the SDGs more? What are the 3 things you would say to her?
Well, of course, she would want to know what policy levers to pull. But I would actually go back a stage and say, you actually need to be tracking your policies much more systematically so that whenever you do think about pulling a lever, you know that it's going to impact these SDGs at home, and if we can do this stuff abroad as well, right? So I think that, and I guess she would be more interested in the impact abroad, I imagine, if they're thinking about development policy as well. So I think the first thing the first thing officials have really got to do is to start realizing that now you can, before you act, you can see what the potential impact of a policy intervention, which SDG indicators are affected. And once we have put the tagging up on our website, that same official could go and say, well, if I want to hit SDG target 2.1, what have we and other countries done which have had a positive effect? And that might actually widen the set of policy options. So I think I want to go upstream in giving you an answer to this, because I think the information and the process is now available to be able to, for a Secretary of State to insist that any policy put before him or her is one where it has been checked against other alternatives that are out there, which could actually do either a better job or perhaps restrict trade less. So I think I would change the process on how policy options are identified and formulated, and then feed whatever that outcome was to the Secretary of State. And I think this is all doable now.
Yes. Simon, thank you very, very much. We should draw this to a close because we're running at the end of our hour. So a huge thank you, Simon. Very important work, really, really interesting, and a very, very big thank you. It just remains for me to say one more thing, which is to let everybody that's online know that our next open occasional webinar will be on the 27th of April with Alan Winters from Sussex, Vivian Gravy from QUB Belfast, and Dan Wincott from University of Cardiff, and they'll be talking about really interesting work that we've been doing at the CITP with a set of citizens' juries around the country to try and understand what people want from trade policy and how they think about different trade-offs from trade policy. So if that interests you, if that excites you, please come to our webinar on the 27th of April. And finally, one more big, big thank you to Simon. Thank you.